Welcome to the deep dive. We're here to wrestle with complex ideas, make them understandable, and, well, hopefully spark some aha moments for you. Today, we're plunging into something you probably think you understand pretty well: vulnerability.
Hmm.
This deep dive is grounded in a really insightful introductory chapter. It's called Current Literary Representations of Vulnerability, Ethical and Aesthetic Concerns.
Right, by Fernandez Santiago and Gámez Fernandez.
Exactly, and it sets up a larger volume representing vulnerabilities in contemporary literature. So our mission for you today is to unpack the sort of general framework of this chapter, and then we'll really zero in on a powerful concept. They introduce something they call the vulnerability scale. We think figuring out this distinction is, well, pretty crucial today.
It really is. Vulnerability, it's a word we hear constantly, right? In just everyday chat, politics, human rights stuff. And usually when we use it, we're implying maybe a disadvantage or weakness.
Yeah, it feels pretty straightforward. But then you look at the academic side, and wow, that simplicity just vanishes. Alison Cole calls it elastic and seemingly multi-purpose. And Benjamin Wisner says its history is long and complex. So why is it so much trickier for scholars than it seems on the surface?
Well, there are just so many ways people or groups can be exposed to harm. Physical location, social status, economics. And on top of that, the definitions are all over the place depending on the field. Public health has one view, psychology another, geography yet another.
Okay.
So this sheer variety has led scholars to dig into its genealogy, basically, tracing where the idea came from and how it evolved. And those debates back in the 80s and 90s about oppression, identity, agency, they really shaped how we talk about vulnerability now.
So that's where terms like social vulnerability or racial vulnerability come from.
Exactly. They show it's not just one monolithic thing. It has facets, layers.
And what really strikes me is how differently even major organizations define it. You take the UN Office for Disasters Risk Reduction, the UNDRR.
Right. Their definition is all about conditions determined by physical, social, economic, and environmental factors or processes which increase the susceptibility to the impacts of hazards. It sounds very concrete, tangible. It does, doesn't it? Very hazard focused. But then you pivot to the humanities. Scholars like Marina Berzins-McCoy see it, well, much more broadly, philosophically almost.
Oh, so?
As part of the human condition. It's about living as temporal creatures who undergo change and transformations, just being human, essentially.
Wow. Okay, so that really highlights the spectrum you mentioned, from specific external conditions on one end to this inherent ontology, the state of being, on the other, and whether it's about the individual or the whole social group.
Precisely. It's a huge range.
Okay, so we've got these, let's say, tangled definitions. Now, the chapter brings up some really interesting theoretical tensions. Is vulnerability something we respond to ethically, like on a personal level? A feeling of responsibility? Or is it fundamentally political, something demanding societal change? How do those ideas sort of rub against each other?
That's a really powerful question. You have thinkers like Emmanuel Levinas, who talks about the ethical call of the face of the other. And it's not literally just a face, but more like the raw, exposed humanity you encounter, especially when someone's vulnerable.
Okay.
It's that moment, seeing another suffering. It just demands something from you ethically. It disrupts your own little world and makes you responsible, compels you.
That makes a lot of sense. So how does Judith Butler pick up on this, especially thinking about the post-9/11 context?
Butler. She really ran with the concept after 9/11. She used it to talk about the undesirable exposure of nations and peoples to war-related acts of violence. And she has this really critical question. Amidst all the nationalism, whose lives actually mattered, whose vulnerabilities were being ignored, made invisible.
Right. And her work brings in this absolutely crucial distinction, doesn't it? I think this is key for you to grasp. There's precariousness. That's the baseline vulnerability we all share just by being alive, mortal. We get sick, we age, we depend on others.
One's life is always, in some sense, in the hands of the other, as she puts it.
Exactly. But then there's precarity, and that's different. That's the unfair stuff, the politically created vulnerability.
Yes.
Where specific groups are way more exposed to harm because the systems, the social and economic nets, just fail them.
It's a politically induced condition. That's the core difference. Being human versus being systemically let down.
Got it. And the chapter contrasts Butler's, let's say, more nuanced view with Martha Albertson Feynman's vulnerability theory. Feynman sees it more as a universal heuristic tool.
Yeah, for Feynman, it's almost biological. Humans are all vulnerable and constantly so. Vulnerability is the human condition. Full stop.
But there's a critique there, right, from Davis and Aldieri.
Yes. They argue Feynman's view doesn't quite capture, well, two things. First, how technology is changing what it even means to be human, those technologized human ontologies. And second, it maybe doesn't fully address the specific targeted disadvantage that Butler's precarity really zeroes in on.
Okay.
So they argue Butler's concepts are maybe better tools for tackling our current world because she explicitly acknowledges that, look, some of us are more vulnerable than others.
So it's not just universal, it's also unequal. That's the takeaway.
Exactly. Now, shifting gears a bit towards literature.
Okay.
While stories about vulnerability are, as old as literature itself, studying it through this specific lens of vulnerability studies is actually pretty recent.
Really? Why the surge now?
Well, it seems strongly linked to anxieties of our time, apocalyptic feelings. Certainly 9/11 was a huge catalyst, but also global interconnectedness, migration, digital life, and obviously the recent pandemic experience. Literature tends to reflect our deepest collective worries.
Which brings up this really fascinating tension the chapter highlights. It's almost paradoxical.
On one side, Jean-Michel Ganteau suggests that vulnerable texts, stories that really explore human weakness mentally or physically, can actually do something positive. They can help trigger political change based on a social ethics of vulnerability and mutual care. That sounds, well, hopeful.
It does sound hopeful. But then you have the counterpoint from philosopher Byung-Chul Han. He warns that in our world, which is just saturated with information and images, sensationalism or simple overexposure to suffering can actually backfire. It can blunt the moral imperative, make us numb, less likely to care.
So it could actually increase vulnerability instead of fostering that solidarity Ganteau hopes for.
That's the risk, Han points out, yes.
Wow. So it's like a coin then. Vulnerability can be the source of strength, connection, positive change.
Right.
Or it can be linked to harm, desensitization, being ignored. It's not simple. That the Janus-faced nature they mention. That's precisely it. Janus, the two-faced god, looking both ways. The volume explores this duality, the positive side, resilience, maybe self-sacrifice, and the negative, like ungrievability, precarity. And it also digs into how the fourth industrial revolution, our digital lives, interacting with human and even non-human others, how all that is creating new kinds of vulnerability.
Okay, so we've navigated these complex definitions, the ethical debates, but how does all this help us understand how vulnerability actually gets shown? In stories, art, media. This, I think, is where the vulnerability scale concept really comes into its own. The chapter presents it as a framework, right, to understand the type of ethical response that visibilization elicits from ethically responsive subjects.
Basically, it's a tool to map how representations work, kind of along different opposing poles.
Yeah, let's break down some of those key pairs on the scale. First up, invisible, visible. This just highlights a basic truth. Whether we feel compelled to respond ethically often hinges on whether we even see the vulnerability. How's it made visible or kept hidden? Makes sense. If you don't see it, you can ignore it. And that links directly to the next pair, non-grievable.
Right, drawing on Butler again.
She argues that vulnerability often comes precisely from practices that stop us from mourning certain lives, from acknowledging their loss as significant.
Exactly. Making precarious lives visible can, strangely, sometimes minimize them, if not done carefully.
And those non-grievable lives, those are the ones whose loss isn't publicly acknowledged or valued. It's a stark measure of who counts.
Very stark. Then we have stigmatized, spectacularized. This is where ethics and aesthetics get really tangled.
How so?
Well, visibility is vital, right? But spectacularization, turning suffering into a kind of spectacle, maybe like some overly dramatic charity appeals that can lead to burnout, desensitization. It might blunt empathy or even make us recoil, potentially making things worse, not better.
So it's walking a tightrope?
A very fine line, yeah, between inclusion and stigma, between genuine solidarity and just pity.
That's a really critical point, and it leads into face care, which echoes Levinas.
Based on that ethical demand, the nonviolent openness of the face's vulnerability.
So the face is the call.
And care is the response, the action taken.
Got it. Then we shift to more positive framings. Resilience, redemption.
Right. These point out that vulnerability isn't always just negative. It can actually signify, maybe paradoxically, superior strength or a capacity for self-sacrifice.
Yeah.
Resilience is about coping, bouncing back from harm. Redemption suggests maybe transforming or overcoming vulnerability, often through struggle.
But things can also go the other way, with heroized, demonized, ridiculized.
Absolutely. Vulnerability can be framed as heroic, the character overcoming huge odds. But negative portrayals can demonize the vulnerable, paint them as villains, or simply ridicule them, which trivializes their situation.
And finally, there's this kind of spectrum of intensity. Radical vulnerability,
Well,
invulnerability.
Radical vulnerability refers to those really extreme conditions, sometimes so extreme they become uninhabitable for the audience, like too disturbing or alienating, causing repulsion. Then vulnerability itself, the core concept, the universal condition we've discussed.
And invulnerability.
That's the dream, right? The utopian ideal, often symbolized by gods or superheroes in fiction. Total prevention of harm.
Okay, so the chapter states that the demand of an ethical response ranks on a hierarchy of visibilization directly correlating with strategies of representation. That sounds dense, but basically means how vulnerability is shown really shapes your reaction.
Exactly. The strategy matters hugely, whether it's defamiliarization, sensationalism, sentimentalism, or performance. It changes how you pay attention and whether you feel that ethical pull.
Let's take those one by one. Defamiliarization, like in sci-fi or fantasy.
Right. Making the familiar strange. It can grab your attention, make you look closer because it's new, unusual, but it can also create distance. If the subject feels too alien, maybe that ethical connection weakens.
Okay. What about sensationalism, making it shocking?
That aims for a big ethical punch, amplifying the negative to really provoke a response. But the risk, it becomes unwelcome or ridiculous. You might just turn away, repulsed.
Right.
And interestingly, if the exaggeration focuses only on the positive, like making the character unbelievably heroic, the ethical demand might actually drop because the need for a response feels less urgent.
That's counterintuitive.
It can be. Then you've got sentimentalism, pulling at the heartstrings.
The sad puppy dog eyes approach.
Kind of, yeah. It aims to connect emotionally,
Mm-hmm.
but if it's overdone or relies on stereotypes about who needs saving, it can feel manipulative or even reinforce ideas about autonomy and self-sufficiency, ironically hindering our ability to see vulnerability, even our own.
Interesting. And the last one, performance.
This is where the text itself might seem vulnerable. Maybe it's fragmented, confusing, self-aware. It demands more from you, the reader. You have to work harder to engage. The vulnerable text needs you to be vulnerable to it to let it affect you.
Wow. Okay. So this vulnerability scale, it's not just labels, it's a dynamic tool.
Definitely. It helps you understand the complex dance between the how of representation and the what of our response, care, pity, disgust, action. It reveals the mechanics behind our reactions.
So wrapping this up, what's the big picture for you, the listener? It's clear that representing vulnerability isn't simple. It's loaded with ethical choices, aesthetic choices, big stakes. This chapter and the whole volume it introduces really tries to dig into these nuances, especially now in our hyper-connected, often overwhelming world.
Absolutely. Understanding these dynamics feels more critical than ever, especially as, what it means to be human keeps changing with technology of the fourth industrial revolution. And as we interact with more and more kinds of otherness, whether that's human, artificial, or even environmental.
Yeah. That Janus-faced nature of vulnerability really sticks with me looking back at old ideas, but also forward to what's emerging. So here's something for you to mull over. How might our own digital lives, our constant online interactions be reshaping vulnerability right now? And how will stories, how will literature, keep finding ways to make us confront these evolving realities?